Hi, everyone, and welcome to my show called We Were Lied to About 9/11. I am your host, John Gold, and this show is part of the Soapbox People's Network. This week, I'm having a four-part series that covers a multitude of issues. This is part one.
Hi, this is John, and I thought that I was done with this show, but I was given an opportunity to speak to someone I wanted to speak to from the beginning, so here I am today, and I'm here with Paul Thompson. Paul, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good.
All right, excellent. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read Paul's bio for everyone. Paul Thompson is the author of The Terror Timeline, a compilation of over 5,000 reports and articles concerning the September 11, 2001 attacks. The book was based on research conducted by himself and other contributors to the History Commons website. Thompson's research in the field has garnered over 100 radio interviews, along with TV interviews on Fox News and Air America, and interviews in print, such as for Buzz magazine. Articles about himself, his research, and its reception by the 9/11 Truth Movement have appeared in the Village Voice and Esquire magazines' Genius issue, and recognition as, quote, an authority on terrorism, end quote, even though, quote, he never studied or trained, end quote, as noted by Esquire. In 2005, Thompson was asked to speak at a congressional briefing on the 9/11 Commission's final report. He addressed what he defined as failures by the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, and North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD. Paul Thompson was born in Pacific Beach, California, and currently holds a psychology degree from Stanford University obtained in 1990. He now spends time there and in San Diego. He is a freelance researcher and has worked in the past as an environmental activist at an environmental protection firm. Mr. Thompson has made numerous appearances on Link TV and Free Speech TV. He helps these independent channels raise money. All right, that's Paul's bio, and I wrote a little personal bio for Paul that I'm going to read for him now. Paul Thompson is a hero of mine. He is certainly one of, if not my biggest influence. The release of the August 6th PDB gave both of us a kick in the ass as to do something about the lies of 9/11, but Paul did something so spectacular and so important that in my mind he deserves the greatest recognition. I'm talking about the complete 9/11 timeline available at www.historycommons.org, which I have called on several occasions one of the most important websites on the Internet. I have spent years studying the timeline, and I still come across entries that surprise me. I have tried for many years to mimic the way I think Paul would present information. I'm basically a poor man's Paul Thompson. I want to thank him for everything that he has done, and that was for you.
Well, thanks a lot. That's high praise. It's nice to know that someone appreciates that because I worked so many hours on that and I didn't get a whole lot of feedback. So when people look at an encyclopedic type thing, they usually don't go contact the author. They just kind of use it as a reference. So it's good to get to know that I've had an impact.
Oh, I've told, when I was talking with Ray before on this show, I told him that I would feel naked without the complete 9/11 timeline.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, all right, so we're going to get to the questions. The very first question is, what was the day of 9/11 like for you?
Well, I was living on the West Coast, as I still am, and so I missed the whole thing. By the time I got up and went to work, the attacks were over, and I got into work, and someone was listening to the radio. I was working at like you said in the bio there, I was working for an environmental group, and there was some mention just as soon as I came in about 10,000, maybe 20,000 people being killed in New York, and I was just completely baffled. I had no idea what that could be about. So pretty much everyone at work, we just sat around and listened to the radio. We didn't have a TV, and then I went home and, of course, watched all the images over and over again. So at that time, I was just ordinary person who had no connection. I didn't know anyone who was, lost any relatives or loved ones. I was far from the whole thing. So I just thought, wow, that's pretty amazing, pretty weird, and I just kind of moved on with my life. So I didn't really get involved until about a year later.
Right, and that brings us to my next question. What was the first thing you questioned about 9/11?
Yeah, well, like I said, about a year later, maybe summer of 2002, if you remember, that's when a lot of the stories started to come out about all the different warnings, and there was the story of the PDB, the Bin Laden determined to strike in U.S. that hit the newspapers around that time. So I had just accepted the story at face value up until that point, and then I started to see these news reports, and I just sort of fell down a rabbit hole where I realized that what I had been hearing was not the true story, and I wanted to know what the true story was. So just for my own edification, to make sense of this complicated thing, I started working on a timeline, and I had no plans for it. I didn't think of sharing it on the internet or doing anything with it, really. I just wanted to understand for myself, and it grew into a bit of an obsession, and it just kept growing and growing and growing. And so at some point, some friends I had were like, you got to do something with this. This is pretty interesting stuff you have here. So I put it on the web, I think, in late 2002, and then that just made it, continue to grow even more, and other people chimed in and contributed, and so it just was this sort of organic process that I really fell backwards into it. I had no interest really in terrorism. In a way, I still don't. I would have never imagined that this would be something that I would be spending so much time on, and I definitely had no particular background to qualify me for anything. But I just felt that I had to know what the true story was. I had to understand what was going on, because 9/11 wasn't just another terrorist attack. It was something that radically changed the history of not only the United States but the entire world, that we're still dealing with a post-9/11 world that, if that would have never happened, the things, I think, would have gone in a very different direction. So in order to really understand the world around me, I felt like I had to get into this topic, even though I didn't have any particular fascination with terrorism or Al-Qaeda or any of these things. But you have to know these things in order to make sense of all of this that's been happening, and the implications on domestic policy, on civil liberties, on foreign policy, on just, our entire way of life.
It's amazing, because none of us know what we're doing when we get into this, and being an activist is a learning process, and you basically have to develop a PR campaign that reaches the most people, and it's trial and error, and we do the best that we can. Who would have thought that I would be focusing on terrorism today, or, like you said, foreign policy, or any of those things? I never in a million years would have thought that.
Yeah.
All right. Have you read the released 28 pages with redactions, and was there anything that stood out to you?
Yes, I did. Well, on first glance, it was, most of it was not that surprising to me, because a lot of it, the vast majority of it, was just confirmation of things that had already been reported in the news. For instance, a lot of it focuses, almost all of it focuses on the two hijackers in San Diego, Khalid Al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, and their various connections to Saudi officials and Saudi helpers. And most of that had been reported, as far back as 2002, most of it had been reported. But, upon closer inspection, there are a lot of interesting things that we didn't know before. And I would say the main thing about it that I think people should be making a big deal about is that it both confirms and adds to what we know about Prince Bandar, who was the Saudi ambassador for a long, long time, since the early 80s until about 2006. And it's a really strange thing if you look into this Prince Bandar connection, because he seems to have been directly funding through kind of a pass-through through his wife going to another wife, these two people, Omar al-Bayoumi and Osama Basnan, who it's widely believed were paid spies by the Saudis, who were supposed to keep an eye on the Saudi community in San Diego and look at is anybody there doing something that could be potentially harmful to Saudi interests. There's a lot of dissidents and so forth, and the Saudi government is very, they're a dictatorship, and they crack down on that sort of thing. So you can really see the money flow in a way that is clear. There were times that it went through the wives, but there were even some direct payments, and directly to Basnan or to Bayoumi. And then we find out these strange connections having to do with some phone numbers. Like there's this person, Abu Zubaydah, who was he has a very strange role. Some people say he's not Al-Qaeda. Some people say he was one of the very most important Al-Qaeda. I think
it's somewhere in between, actually.
Yeah, well, it's a strange thing. He also there's stories that he may have been sort of mentally ill in some kind of way. So he's a very strange character. I think what he was basically was kind of like a human switchboard, if you will. He was based in a border town between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and he worked closely with the terrorist training camps in Afghanistan, which not all of them were connected to Al-Qaeda. There were some others. And so if you were a person who wanted to go train in one of those training camps, you sort of went through him. And he was not entirely Al-Qaeda, because he worked with these other groups also, but he was really one of the most important people, because he had all these connections. He had sort of this terrorist Rolodex, if you will, and that's where Prince Bandar comes back in, because when Zubaydah was captured in was March 2002 by the U.S. forces in Pakistan, they looked at his phone book and they found that he had the phone number of this organization that was managing Prince Bandar's house in Colorado. So it wasn't directly Prince Bandar's phone number, but this organization was very secretive. They were not in the phone book, or really there's no way to reach them. And they seem to be like, if you want to talk to him, you have to go through them. So that is very interesting. What is he doing with Prince Bandar's phone number in the United States, basically? And then he also had the number of one of the Saudi embassy bodyguards in Washington, D.C., where Prince Bandar worked. And then furthermore, the 28 pages mentions that someone connected to one of Prince Bandar's personal assistants, their phone number was found in a bin Laden safe house in Pakistan. So you have all these curious connections, and it's doubly curious to me because if you look at the Saudis, it's a very strange situation, because on one hand, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda publicly made it known that their goal was to destroy the Saudi government. They felt that the Saudi government was corrupt and had sort of betrayed their mission of properly guarding the holy sites in Mecca and Medina. And every time practically that bin Laden would give a speech, he would decry the Saudis, and there were some terror attacks even before 9/11 that took place in Saudi Arabia, by Al-Qaeda. So you would think by all logical, measures that they would be mortal enemies, right? But then on the flip side, the Saudis have for years been this very fundamentalist, extreme branch of Islam called Wahhabism, which makes no bones about a goal to convert everyone in the entire world to their very extreme version of Islam. It's well known women can't drive or vote, and just that they're one of the most extreme countries in the world in terms of how they practice Islam. And they have spent a tremendous amount of money promoting this Wahhabist vision throughout the world. I saw one account that was, from not long after 9/11 that said that they had spent $70 billion on this promotion, which often took the form of building big new mosques, which then, as the price of having the mosque, you have to have a Wahhabist imam, the religious leader, so that really spreads the Wahhabist message all around the world. And so at the same time that they have been at odds, Al-Qaeda and the Saudi government, in some ways, they've been very much allies in other ways. It's sort of like, sometimes one policy domestically is 180 degrees from the policy that takes place overseas. So the Saudis definitely, they don't want anyone who's Al-Qaeda or any other radical Islamist group to be blowing up buildings and killing people within Saudi Arabia. But at times they've been very supportive of that happening outside of Saudi Arabia, especially to people or countries that are considered the enemies of Islam. You can look at different countries where there have been conflicts like Bosnia or Chechnya, and you can see a tremendous amount of money that has flowed. I mean, we can look at recent years, and it's very clear, everyone admits that ISIS, which seems to be trying to, be even more extreme than Al-Qaeda, that they're getting a big portion of their funding and their recruits from Saudi Arabia. And that's that's not even that far from, that's next door to Saudi Arabia, and look at what ISIS is doing. They brought back slavery, they have beheadings of people and just all kinds of terrible things, and yet there's a large number of people in Saudi Arabia who would say, go for it, do more, take over more territory. So there's this strange dichotomy, I think you have to agree, between, like a love-hate relationship, if you will, between a lot of the top Saudis, both business people and royals and in the government, and then these Islamist fundamentalist movements.
I agree. And one of the things that I like to point out regarding ISIS, we invaded and occupied Iraq. We killed upwards of 1.25 million people. We displaced millions more. We wounded I don't know how many more. We tortured people. Blackwater was hunting Iraqis for sport. We were flushing Korans down the toilet. I think we were torturing people, but there's no statute of limitations on the kind of anger those things create. So there were a lot of people who were already anti-West, the anti-al-Maliki government. It was very oppressive.
Sure. And what happens is you find when there's all kinds of violence that takes place, massive, homelessness and displacement after a war, that's really a fertile ground for extremist movements of all sorts of different kinds. I mean, like you can look at the United States doing the secret bombing in Cambodia, and then the Khmer Rouge developing and taking over directly because of that. If their country hadn't been war-torn, the Khmer Rouge would have never been able to take over. Or you could look at Libya and how that country is a total state of chaos now, and of course, it's no surprise that ISIS has established a foothold there. So that often happens. But what's curious is that the Saudis, even on some governmental official level, it seems, would support a group as extreme as ISIS, because if ISIS, I think even the same people who support them would recognize that if they were super successful, took over Syria and took over Iraq, they wouldn't stop there. They claim that they're the one legitimate government in the world, that they have the one caliphate, and that the caliphate ultimately needs to control the entire earth. And so sort of almost next on their hit list would be to take over Saudi Arabia. So it's a very strange thing that they're sort of gambling. We want this group to be successful, but not too successful.
They were blocking their borders to prevent ISIS from getting in. But to finish my point, as you said, Saudi Arabia funneled money. In fact, it was Bandar who was responsible for sending in rebels or terrorists or whatever you want to call them into Syria. The United States originally was sending them intelligence. Then we started to send them arms. Then we started to send in our own rebels from Jordan. And the people that I spoke of earlier and the people that we were supporting in Syria essentially started to collaborate amongst themselves. So it's almost, it's of our own creation. Almost.
Yeah, well, let's definitely get back to that. But I want to, for the moment, I want to sort of keep the focus on Prince Bandar. We can come back to ISIS and so forth later, because I think that it's a very interesting case of history repeating itself. But in any case, looking at Prince Bandar, the thing that's so curious is that we've seen that sometimes in Saudi Arabia you get these very fundamentalist Wahhabist die-hard religious types who are big believers in this Wahhabist goal to conquer the world and very anti-Western, and so they give money to groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And yet Prince Bandar never seemed to be that sort of person. In fact, his popular nickname is Bandar Bush, and he has literally been de facto accepted as a member of the Bush family. He's treated like a family member, and he is as Western as any Saudi, that you could think of in terms of his. He's got this multi-million-dollar chalet in Colorado, and he's a real mover and shaker in Washington. He's goes to all the cocktail parties, and he's friends with all the top officials, and just treated very differently from your average foreign diplomat. He's almost, treated like an insider, and this has been, noticed for decades. To give you, an interesting little tidbit, just a few years after he had been made the ambassador, he was one of the key people in the Iran-Contra affair. He gave over $30 million to the Contras because the U.S. government couldn't give the money themselves because of a congressional ban. So this is not the behavior of a typical foreign ambassador at all. It's like it's like one of the insiders, like I said. And so to have him, of all people, be connected to these Saudis in San Diego who are directly assisting the 9/11 hijackers, and then have these other connections come up with Abu Zubaydah and so forth, suggests that he may have been playing a really bizarre double game, where he was on one hand, very, very friendly to the United States, but on the other hand, seemingly willing to allow the 9/11 attack to take place, maybe directly assisting it in financial ways and all sorts of ways. We don't know, but if it were to be most anyone else, this would be front page news. I mean, imagine if we found an Iraqi official or an Iranian official that had these sorts of connections to the 9/11 attacks. We'd never hear the end of it.
Well, one of the things that we can speculate about because of his relationships, as opposed to playing a double game, maybe there was a collaborative effort. I don't know.
Yeah, we just can't know. We are not privy to these private conversations. But just to give another example of how mind-blowing it is, I'm sure you know that just a couple days after 9/11, President Bush and Prince Bandar had a meeting, and a private meeting, and it seems like one of the things that took place in that meeting was discussion on how to get key Saudi royals and bin Laden family members out of the United States. But this was the first foreign diplomat that Bush contacted, in person after 9/11. Very, very important contact there. And in retrospect, I mean, how incredible is it to think that this key seeming ally in the U.S.'s efforts just 2 days after 9/11 may have been the person who was giving hundreds of thousands of dollars, to the 9/11 hijacker cell in San Diego.
Right. I have an entry that doesn't get a lot of attention from historyfoundings.org that I'd like to read, and I'd like to get your opinion on it. March 15th, 2001, Bush tells Saudi prince that military action in Iraq needs to be, quote, decisive. During a meeting with President Bush, Saudi Prince Bandar expresses concern about the U.S.'s continuing patrolling of the, quote, no-fly zone, end quote, in Iraq. The prince complains that it is, quote, costing us militarily, financially, but much more importantly, politically, end quote, and adds that, quote, it is not hurting Saddam Hussein, end quote. Bush seems to agree, quote, if there is any military action, then it has to be decisive, that can finalize the issue, end quote, Bush says. Quote, the Iraqi option is useless and not effective, end quote, and that's according to James Risen's book, State of War. Don't you think it's interesting that the President of the United States is talking about military action in Iraq with one of the individuals who supposedly was involved with the 9/11 attacks, which gave Bush the ability to do what he did?
Right. Well, I've been thinking about this in recent days, and thinking like, why on earth would Prince Bandar want the 9/11 attacks to happen and to be successful? And one thing I've been thinking about that relates very much to that quote you just mentioned is that there was a lot of flack that the Saudi Arabian government was getting after the Gulf War in '91, that they allowed the U.S. to come into Saudi Arabia with 300,000+ troops and attack the Saddam Hussein government, and then afterwards they let them stay. And Saudi Arabia, in Islamic eyes, was considered sort of sacrosanct, whatever you pronounce that word, sacrosanct soil, and that no foreigners, who are of not of the faith, should be stationed there. And so they were getting criticism from all over the Middle East and the Muslim world about this for years, and this was one of the key points that bin Laden would repeatedly harp on in his speeches, was that that they've allowed these infidels to be based in Saudi Arabia. So around the time of 9/11 and thereafter, it became clear that Saudi Arabia was pretty much saying, it's time to go. We want you out of Saudi Arabia. It's causing us too much trouble. And so that's what happened, was that when the U.S. took over, in late, started moving all their troops into the region in late 2002 and then attacked Iraq in 2003, that all those troops that had been based in Saudi Arabia now were based in Iraq. And there were no more troops until this day. There are no more U.S. troops based in Saudi Arabia. There are a few based in the Gulf, in like Bahrain and a few of the other countries, but no more in Saudi Arabia. So this was one of the biggest thorns, in the side of the Saudi government, that having the U.S. there, and having the U.S. attack Iraq and then sort of recenter the U.S. military presence of that Persian Gulf region in Iraq instead of in Saudi Arabia, was very much to the benefit of Saudi Arabia. So if you're looking at that quote and you're thinking from Prince Bandar's point of view, they're thinking probably great, if the U.S. attacks and takes over Iraq, then they can be kicked out Saudi Arabia without us really suffering, because the U.S. wants to have some presence somewhere in the region, not just a small presence of just a couple bases in Bahrain and Qatar, but really a large presence. About 2/3 of all the oil in the world is in the Persian Gulf, and the U.S. has tried to maintain a strong military posture there in order to keep the flow of cheap oil going. So they were not willing to leave Saudi Arabia unless they had somewhere else to go. So I think if you look at it from that point of view, you could see why Prince Bandar was being a sort of a cheerleader for the takeover of Iraq, even though strategically that would be very problematic for Saudi Arabia, because there's this whole Sunni versus Shia divide, and the concern that the Iranians would end up greatly increasing their influence in Iraq, which is what exactly happened. So it was a sort of a gamble, but it looks like I could see why they would want that to happen.
So it definitely seems as if Saudi Arabia wanted Saddam out.
Yeah, you could see, I'm not privy to their internal dialogue. They're a very secretive country, right. But you could see why there would be a logical reason for them to want that to happen.
I think
they really wanted the U.S. troops. They really, really wanted the U.S. troops out, and I think a lot of that had to do with bin Laden, thinking if not just bin Laden, but there's always been this great fear in Saudi Arabia that the people are very unhappy with the leadership, that they feel the leadership is corrupt, that they say one thing and then they do another. They profess to be very religious, but then they are living the playboy life in places like Monaco, and gambling and having all kinds of foreign women and drugs and all this stuff. So there's this, there's the Arab Spring, and so many countries have had their governments overthrown, and that has been the great fear for the Saudis for decades. And so to remove the U.S. troops would remove a major grievance by these potential, fundamentalist movements within Saudi Arabia themselves, who say the government is not legitimate and thus needs to be overthrown.
Well, that makes sense. And there was another, I think Bob Woodward wrote in one of his books that in January of 2003, Cheney, Myers, Bandar, and I think Tennant, I'm not sure, were having a meeting discussing they were planning, what was to take place in Iraq prior to the invasion. So obviously he had a lot of inside knowledge, maybe influence or whatever, with what was going on.
Right. So so then you also see that, time and time again, that the Saudis have used terrorism as a foreign policy tool. They're not afraid to do that. I mean, ISIS is a good example, where they have a problem with Syria. They don't like Assad, and so they support rebel movements, and which they would rather see take over, who are more in line with their Wahhabist beliefs. And you can go to a lot of different countries where you can look and you can see that there are, if not Al-Qaeda or ISIS, groups like that have been supported by the Saudis. And sometimes, they have even threatened or seemingly been involved with terrorist attacks in the West. There was, I don't remember the exact details offhand, but there was something that happened a few years ago with Britain, where, remember, they had the 2005 terror attack there,
right.
And I think a few years after that there was this big arms deal that had been going on for decades called the BAE deal. That was the name of one of the companies involved, which it was a huge multi-billion-dollar deal, mostly between Britain and Saudi Arabia, and there had been accusations of widespread bribery, that the British government had been, paying off millions and millions of dollars to key Saudis as part of that deal, and there was going to be an investigation. And then the Saudi government openly, in the public, pretty much said, kind of like a mob enforcer or something. Like, I don't remember the exact quote, but it was something like, if you persist in these sort of things, we won't be able to stop another terror attack happening in Britain.
Right. Directly from Bandar, I think.
Might have come directly from Bandar. So, you can see this is not just the Saudis that have done this. There's another really good example of a deal like this that happened with the Pakistanis, where the French government was involved in some sort of big arms deal, and they also questioned the terms of the deal and wanted to renegotiate the deal. I don't remember the details, but there was some problem with the deal that was coming up. And then very mysteriously, I think 11 French workers working in Pakistan were killed in a bomb that was blamed, I believe, on Al-Qaeda. And the French there was a French judge did an investigation, and this was a couple of years after 9/11 when the bombing took place. And the judge concluded basically that the Pakistani government, aided and abetted that bombing in order to send a message to the French government, like basically back off on this deal, or else this is what happens to you. So there is this rough Machiavellian power politics that goes on, where people use terrorism as just another arrow in the quiver, if you will, of ways to get things done without really much regard to loss of life or the ethics involved. And so, if you look at that and you look at what Bandar is doing with what was happening in San Diego, anything is possible. I'm not saying that he was aiding and abetting 9/11, but it certainly is something that would need to be seriously investigated.
Well, to make sure that I was right, I looked it up, and there's an article in The Guardian. BAE secret papers reveal threats from Saudi prince, and it just says, Prince Bandar, the head of the Saudi National Security Council and son of the Crown Prince, was alleged in court to be the man behind the threats to hold back information about suicide bombers and terrorists.
Yeah, so there you go. I mean, so he himself is shown in other cases to just use this as a foreign policy tool, and we can see motives why he would have wanted the 9/11 attack to succeed at that time. And an interesting thing about this whole San Diego connection is that I think people often assume that there was this sort of hostile relationship between the Saudi minders, the spies, especially al-Bayoumi and Basnan, and then the hijackers, like they're being watched, but they don't really want to be watched, and get these guys off my back kind of thing, But that is probably not true. If we look at these people like al-Bayoumi and Basnan, they couldn't have been more supportive of the very things that Al-Qaeda was doing, like killing Westerners, using terrorism as a tool, and so forth. For instance, it was discovered just shortly after 9/11. One of them, I have to look up in my notes which one. I think it was Basnan was at a party in San Diego. He hadn't left the country yet, and there was a group of people, seemingly these like-minded Wahhabist people, where witnesses say he was cheering the success of the 9/11 attacks and calling the hijackers great heroes and sort of that sort of language. So this is not someone who's like, I've got to find out if these people are doing something bad, like potentially going to blow something up, and so I've got to pass a warning on. As they were like, right on, go for it, blow something up, kill some Westerners. That they were ideologically just as extreme as the hijackers themselves. And they had along, both Bayoumi and Basnan had been investigated previously for terrorist connections. These are not, like you would think, if the Saudis were legitimately worried about stopping some sort of Al-Qaeda, penetration of the United States, these are not the people that you would put in those jobs, and it's not like this is some sort of mistake, that the Saudis wouldn't have known. I mean, they one of them had a connection going all the way back to the blind sheik in the early 1990s, who was, one of the people behind the sort of the religious leader behind the blowing up of the World Trade Center in 1993, and so on and so forth. I mean, the more you dig, the more you see that there's this very obvious terrorist connections and terrorist loyalties amongst these supposed Saudi minders. And they're not just, watching. They were funding. They were helping. You need a flight school. Here, we'll get you set up with someone who can do that for you. Here, we'll pay your rent, and so all down the line, this was not just people keeping an eye on potentially suspicious people, but that's how it's largely appeared in the press.
Well, let's get back to the 28 pages. One of the revelations from the pages, what we've heard in the past is that the payments went from Princess Haifa's account directly to one of the wives, I forget, al-Bayoumi or Osama Basnan, but we found in the 28 pages a direct payment to Basnan from Prince Bandar. It says, quote, on at least one occasion, Basnan received the check directly from Prince Bandar's account. According to the FBI, on May 14, 1998, Basnan cashed a check from Bandar in the amount of $13,000. Basnan's wife also received at least one check directly from Bandar. She also received one additional check from Bandar's wife, which she cashed on January 8, 1998 for $10,000. That was on page 427. That was one of the bigger revelations in the pages. What do you think?
Well, I think that's interesting. There's also the fact that in 2002, I believe in May, when the King of Saudi Arabia and Prince Bandar and sort of the royal entourage was in Houston. Then I believe it was Bosnan also went to Houston, and I think he lost his passport there, so there was proof that he was in Houston on the same day. And the 28 pages mentions that he met with a high-ranking royal while he was there.
I just wrote an article about that, and in the entry on historycommons.org, it describes the individual that he met with as someone that traveled with suitcases full of cash. And the only person I could find described like that is Prince Bandar. So,
it may not have been Prince Bandar, because the 28 pages always refers to him as the ambassador, and in that particular passage I noticed that they mentioned it was a royal. So it may or may not, but it's kind of a moot point, because usually when you're dealing with these sort of people, you've got to realize that Prince Bandar has to be savvy that he is being monitored by certainly U.S. intelligence and possibly other intelligence agencies. The Mossad, I'm sure, would want to know everything he's doing, right? And so if they, usually use third parties or cutouts of some type. That's why, you probably wouldn't find Prince Bandar's phone number directly with Abu Zubaydah, but we find that his bodyguard has the phone number. So you have someone one step removed who can just pass messages on. I would be shocked if there was a direct meeting, but there didn't. There's no need to have a direct meeting. They know how to do these things through these third parties, right? But the fact that you would be going, brazenly after 9/11 and meeting with the entourage of the King of Saudi Arabia, it's pretty ballsy. Just no matter who you met with within that entourage, and how is it that he hadn't been arrested yet at that point? It's pretty incredible. I mean, the thing I mentioned about the party. Yeah, that was known very shortly after 9/11, and yet, he continued to stay in the United States all the way until the end of 2002.
And they finally let him go because of visa violations.
Right, and it was only days after he left that we started to get the first news stories that revealed his connection with the hijackers, and so that had been held until he was out of the country. So the whole thing was very suspicious that these people, and I'll go into this more later, seem to act with impunity, who are connected with the Saudis, that the U.S. has such a hands-off policy that the mere fact that he would not even be worried for a whole year and continue to live in the United States sort of says a lot. We have to remember that this was a time when the United States was just picking up every, Tom, Dick, and Harry that was Muslim and throwing them in jail. There was between 1,000 and 2,000 people in the United States that were held for months after 9/11. A lot of them being held as quote unquote material witnesses. And the vast majority, all but maybe one or two of them, ended up having no connection whatsoever with anything having to do with terrorism or Al-Qaeda, right? And yet, you still have al-Bayoumi feeling like he doesn't even have to leave the country. And, and you have Guantanamo opening up. You have all these reports already coming about people being mysteriously renditioned, which started to happen within days after 9/11, even from first world countries. There were a couple of people, for instance, renditioned from Sweden just a week after 9/11 and, put in some torture dungeon in some Middle Eastern country. And yet, he and others we can go into some of the others, they just seem to be like not even worried.
Right. All right, so let's get into the next question. Since the 28 pages were released, the Saudi ambassador and the U.S. government have come out on several occasions and said that there was nothing new in the recently declassified 28 pages. Obviously, we just talked about that to a great extent. What do you think about people like John Brennan coming out and saying that there's nothing in those pages, or the Saudi ambassador referring to us as conspiracy theorists? To me, that's
well, I would just say, of course they're going to say that, because there has been a cover-up from day one or day two after 9/11 until today, and so why would they change their behavior, now? They're just going to keep covering this stuff up. There was a lot of information in there that was new. I mean, we talked about the Bandar connection, but there was a lot of other interesting stuff in there. I thought it was, for instance, quite interesting what it said about a couple of the bin Ladens who were living in the United States, like Abdullah bin Laden, who was living in Washington, D.C. He was actually working at the Saudi embassy at the time, and he also was working for some Saudi charities, which often turn out to be front for terrorist activity. He was working with a group called WAMI. And so the 28 pages mentions that he's a close friend of someone called Qadir Harumani, who's, I've looked at all this stuff very closely with the 9/11 timeline. Never heard of this guy before, but apparently he was an associate of Mohammed Atta and Marwan al-Shihi, two of the pilots of the 9/11 hijackers. Prior to 9/11, he'd been under investigation before 9/11, and Abdullah had been under investigation before 9/11 for terrorism ties, and yet, despite this, Abdullah was able to leave the country on one of these flights that took place just 2 or 3 days after 9/11, and you probably remember there was all this controversy, and that was considered a conspiracy theory for a while, and the 9/11 Commission kind of put out a statement in their report that sort of poo-pooed it as, well, yeah, those flights took place, but they got a chance to be interviewed before they left, and
exactly
so
what they said.
Yeah.
One of the people that left on those flights was somebody by the name of Khalil bin Laden, who was the brother of Osama bin Laden, and he was wanted in Brazil, I think, for terrorist reasons.
Right, but here we have, with this Abdullah bin Laden, it seems a direct connection with some of the hijackers through this close friend. And then I believe I read somewhere else about Abdullah bin Laden that one of the members of the Hamburg cell, not one of the hijackers, but one of the associates, was found with the phone number of Abdullah bin Laden. So in retrospect, it's looking awfully suspicious that this person was somehow involved to the 9/11 plot. And we have to remember also that the hijackers, a few weeks or months before 9/11, a bunch of them moved to Falls Church, Virginia, which is very near Washington, D.C., and that's where Abdullah bin Laden worked. His job was, where he worked at this WAMI organization, was 3 blocks from where the 4 of the hijackers were living, including Nawaf al-Hazmi. So to have this person just put on a plane within 3 days of the attacks, I'm sure that what they knew at that time was very limited. How much can you learn that quickly?
Right.
So they never got a chance to find all these connections until after he was out of the country and out of reach forevermore. Because once you're in Saudi Arabia, you're never going to be accessed again. That was a real travesty, and they did interview them, but they were apparently basically literally interviewed sort of on the tarmac, very quickly, like, before you hop on the plane, do you have any ties to terrorism? No? Okay. It was very perfunctory. They didn't know what to ask, and they just, got on the plane. So, that what we learn now from the 28 pages is that that's yet another thing that the 9/11 Commission was totally wrong about.
Well, why do you think the pages were kept classified for so long?
Well, again, I mean, we just see this ongoing cover-up, and I think the Saudi connection, in particular, is one of those sore spots that the cover-up, in a sense, began decades before 9/11. That it's always been this very sensitive issue. I have things in the timeline, going back to the early 90s where there, for instance, there was a wiretapping of some of the Saudi royals that happened at that time because of concerns about terrorism ties, and then they stopped the wiretapping because they basically said, you can't do that. They're Saudi royals. Our relationship with them is too important. We can't risk it. I mean, we don't even want to know if they find there's terrorism ties, so why are we even doing this, right?
There are several instances in the 90s of Saudi protection. There's Volga Betrayal with Robert Wright. Let's see. In 1996, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia allegedly collaborated on illegal weapons deliveries to Bosnian Muslims. In June 25th, 1996, CIA agents are told not to track militants in Saudi Arabia.
Right. I mean, we could go on all day because it's. I mean, the Saudis were so tied to terrorism that they said at one point. When the CIA sort of had a rare chance to meet with some of their counterparts in Saudi Arabia with the intelligence agency there, they were sort of walking around the building, and they noticed that a lot of the computers of the people working on the intelligence agency had screensavers that were a picture of Osama bin Laden. So this, the intelligence agency that supposedly kicked Osama bin Laden out of the country in the early 90s, here we are in the late 90s, are openly showing that they're supporters. Like they wouldn't even lose their job for having a screensaver with a big smiling picture of bin Laden. So, and you can just go on and on that it mentions in the I believe in the 28 pages somewhere that 70-80% of the people of Saudi Arabia at the time of 9/11 were believed to be supporting Osama bin Laden in the sense that they were hoping that he would be successful in his war against the West. So that has been a constant problem, that they have been this big supporter of terrorism, and yet because of diplomatic reasons, because we're so addicted to the oil that comes from Saudi Arabia especially, that the 28 pages also mentions that there was no unit, no particular focus, anyone who'd been tasked prior to 9/11 to look into that. Every time someone did, they would be told, go look into something else. So, we see that continues. After 9/11, we can see that continues all the way until this day. It's the surprising thing maybe is that they even got the 28 pages released at all, because, there's just been so much cover-up about this that goes back so far, or that the 28 pages were ever compiled in the first place. And that's a whole other thing that I could go into, is that, to me, the sort of half of the interest about 28 pages is not what's in the 28 pages, but what's not in the 28 pages, because that's a snapshot in time, right? That was compiled in late 2002. So we could look at what else did the U.S. intelligence community know in that time period that was very much relevant to the Saudis, and how come that stuff didn't get into the 28 pages? For instance, we now know, it took many years to find out, about this Al-Hiji family in Sarasota, Florida. I'm sure you know all about it. Didn't come out until 2011, I believe, that there's this family, seemingly normal family living in suburbia, typical home in a gated community. But before 9/11, I think about 2 weeks before 9/11, they left in such a haste that they left food on the table, in the refrigerator, cars in the driveway, left 3 cars behind, one of them brand new. They left the pool machine running, the pool filter, clothes in the closet. They just got up and left like they had to be out of the country in 15 minutes kind of thing. And then we find out that because of the phone calls, the phone records, and also because it was a gated community, they were able to track the license plates of the cars coming and going. We find that Muhammad Atta visited. We find, Marwan al-Shihi visited, Ziad Jarrah. And then what I find very interesting is this other fellow who's not one of the hijackers, Adnan, I believe his name is Shukri Juma, who I hope we get into him, talk to him about him a little more later. But he's ended up, years later, it seems to have been that he's kind of the operational commander of Al-Qaeda. So this is not just some guy. Even at the time, before 9/11, he was already under investigation by the FBI for 2 separate terrorism plots. And yet he seems to have also been connected to this house. And then that was not mentioned at all in the 28 pages. And that, to me, is possibly the most important connection between the Saudis and the hijackers that's ever been discovered. Maybe even more than all this stuff in San Diego. The father of the family, I don't know why he has a different name, but the father of the Al-Hiji family is known as Assam Ghazawi, and he was apparently an advisor to a nephew of the king of Saudi Arabia, of King Fahd. So again, we keep seeing all these connections that go back to not just, maybe here's a few people in Saudi Arabia, a private business person or whatever who wants to fund terrorism, but we're finding connections that go right up to the top.
That is the end of part 1. Please be sure to check out the other 3 shows in this series. Thank you.